So I'd like to express my great pleasure at being here in Fukui. I've never been here before, and it's a great delight for me to be here. And I don't just say that as a matter of pure necessity, expectation that the visitor says nice things about the places to which he or she has been invited. I genuinely mean how much I've enjoyed my stay in the last 3 or 4 days, and how exceptional this place seems, and how interesting it seems. And I appreciate enormously the help that's been given to me by various people, in particular by my dear friend, Juhai Hosaya. The context in which this paper is being given is one of great complexity all over the world. In fact, virtually the entire world is being reconfigured at the present time. As a result, largely but not only, of course, through the rise all of a sudden, or seemingly very suddenly, of Donald Trump as President of the United States, and of the increasing significance in the world as a whole, not only in Europe and North Atlantic, but of the Brexit phenomenon, namely the attempt of Great Britain, or the United Kingdom as it's usually called, to leave the EU, the European Union. These circumstances, which I've just mentioned, are more than closely bound up with considerable problems in East Asia, or they are problems within East Asia and looking at East Asia from outside, most notably involving North and South Korea, plus, of course, problems relating to that problem in Japan and China. Of course, these issues intersect very conspicuously, and to many people very clearly, with contemporary political problems in the Middle East, centered upon Israel, Syria, but also involving Turkey and increasingly Russia as well, not to speak of Iran. As I proceed in my talk, I will touch on certain aspects of these phenomena which I must just mention, but I shall begin, for the most part, by sketching in an autobiographical way my own ways of being in Japan and the way in which I come to be here today. My first visit to Japan was almost exactly 30 years ago, in 1986. This arose from my having been awarded a fellowship by the University of Tokyo, and fellowship came from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. This award, which came via the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Tokyo, enabled me to travel and required me to travel to various regions and cities in many parts of Japan, but not to the southwest, namely Okinawa and northwards, nor to Hokkaido. Since then, however, I have been to most parts of Japan, except, I emphasize, unfortunately, not to Hokkaido. I should say here at the outset that I have 2 primary, general, and intellectual interests. These are, or have been, culture and religion on the one hand, and globalization and localization, they are closely related, on the other. These 2 interests, or sets of interests, have met via a concern with world politics and with international relations generally. In this connection, I should say that the word geocultural has appeared very much in my work and is becoming an increasingly used term, although not one that is particularly familiar to many students. The word geoculture has appeared recently in academic life largely as a result of the great and increasing significance of religion and of culture generally in international affairs. The obvious way in which religion is significant is concerned particularly, of course, the significance of Islam, so-called wars which arise, or cultural wars which arise around the world, resulting from the clash between Islam and Christianity, between Christianity and Judaism, and so on. I first developed my own ideas concerning globalization as a result of my reading and having received as a Christmas present a book called The Oxford Dictionary of New Words, published in English in 1991. It so happened that my interest in Japan had developed in tandem with my growing concern with what I called, and others called, but apparently not so much in the eastern part of the world, as globalization. Broadly speaking, what I meant then by the term globalization had to do with the way in which the affairs of the world as a whole seemed to be drifting towards, sometimes very fast, towards the world becoming a single place. Now this was a very important problem, not least because when at the end of my first visit to Japan, I was required and was eager to give a lecture on my thoughts about Japan. And during that talk to the people at the University of Tokyo, particularly the Department for Related Studies, I insisted a lot on using this term globalization, which caused some great concern in the audience. They didn't really seem to understand what I meant by that word. So during that talk, my use of the term globalization was, I learned, often translated as internationalization. This tendency occurred during 2 or 3 of my subsequent visits to Japan. In other words, people kept translating globalization as internationalization. They wouldn't stop doing it, to my chagrin. I should say, in any case, that this problem about the difference between internationalization and globalization has subsequently not been such a problem. I just said that this conflation, this confusion between internationalization and globalization continued after my first visit. And the best example of that from my own point of view was when my first book on globalization was translated into Japanese, published in 1997. There was considerable discussion concerning how that word globalization should in fact be translated. In other words, there was still a problem even in the late part of the century. It happened that the book that I've just mentioned, the Dictionary of New Words, which appeared in English, obtained as a definition of localization, or what when Japanese was called Dochikuka. That Dochikuka was translated as, more or less, as localization, and that's where my own inspiration to use this term came from. Apparently, the term Dochikuka meant, as I read this dictionary, to mean approximately living on one's own land. In other words, each person resided on a piece of land, used a piece of land, but in different ways from other people. So, in other words, according to this dictionary, these terms, particularly terms surrounding such words as Dochiku and Dochikuka, had originated from the agricultural principle of farming, one's farming techniques, adapting them to local circumstances. However, such terms as local and localization, and this is very important, had become central aspects of business jargon even in Japan itself, at the same time that people was finding to be a new word. The major locus or major location of such terms as Dochikuka had in fact been Japan, to many people's surprise, including many people's surprise, being surprised in Japan itself. A country which had for a very long time strongly cultivated what's called the spatial cultural significance of Japan itself. So Japan's conception of itself was in a sense very global. Now, it might be useful here to say a little bit more briefly what I mean by this term global, although some people will already learn something about that. When I use the term global, I am referring to what is called the interpenetration of the local and the global. In other words, they need each other. You can't have the local without the global. You can't have the global without the local. By the beginning of this period, about the period of which I'm talking, which is to say the late part of the 20th century, this problem of the relationship between the global and the local had been very strong in a number of disciplines and in a number of general conversations around the world. But it was only in the business context or business contexts that serious attempts were made to solve this problem. But I emphasize it wasn't really a problem. It's looked upon as having been a problem that people no longer regarded as a problem. In effect, the very terms global and globalization are probably best regarded as being somewhat pretentious if one considers their use or the equivalence of their use in a business context. In other words, the average business person, man or woman, might well say, what's the problem? We have to accommodate every global phenomenon to the local one. Otherwise, we can't do proper business with people around the world, or even in the prefecture next door us. However, even though I'm saying this is part of our everyday life that we take for granted, we just go do without thinking much about it, solving the so-called problem between the local and the global, it has become by now a very serious academic intellectual issue. So the term globalization and associated terms like the global and locality have become, partly under the influence of serious academic discussion, essential social scientific ideas. It must be strongly emphasized, however, that these words, local, localization, those kinds of phrases and terms, frequent, have been until recently, and still are, very much ridiculed and mocked in various parts of the world, in newspapers and magazines and even on TV and radio. And very many people, even throughout the 1990s, were saying these words won't survive. They're just ridiculous. They're not necessary to serious everyday discussion or intellectual discussion. But obviously they have survived, and they're surviving very well, thank you. So what seems to be the inevitable survival and increase in the use of the word global is evident in the recent foundation, including one particularly at Seito in Japan, Seito University in Japan. The appearance of websites, of journals, of institutes, of special programs devoted to this subject in various ways is increasing, as I said, rapidly. There's one amusing, in a sense it's amusing, comment I have here, and that relates to a visit I made to Japan in the early years of the present century. Upon arriving at Narita Airport, I picked up a copy of the Japan Times before it was taken over, or partly taken over by the New York Times. Much to my surprise, in there was an article on, guess what? Localization. To put the matter very simply, the word global had itself gone around the world. It had been localized. The word had been localized. It had started in Japan, as far as I was concerned, circulated around the world, but not used in Japan. Came all the way around the world, back to Japan, and was considered to be a word which helped Japan. It was new, but helped it. It so happened that on my first visit to Japan in 1986, that my first visit had been immediately followed by a visit to New Mexico, which many of you will know is of particular significance, somewhat tragic significance, namely that I was moved in a few weeks from the place where the atomic bomb was developed and used and first used in an experimental way, to the very place, because I went to Hiroshima on my visit to Japan, to the very place where it was first dropped, which is very moving, I must say, to go from one place to the other and see the horrible consequences of that. It perhaps would be helpful to take a very brief glance at my external experience of Japan. That's to say, how I have experienced Japan from outside, the way in which I thought of it, and even began to think of it even before I came here. I want to confine my observations in a very specific way, of course, to Fukui. Even though I haven't been here until 3 or 4 days ago. I'd heard much about it, particularly via people who were studying here or taught here. So my major, as it were, serious confrontation, if that's the right word, with the whole issue of Japan and things Japanese was through my immersion in and membership of the Asian Studies program at the University of Pittsburgh in the USA. So I am, when I speak about this, talking at Fukui from the outside as an observer, as somebody who thought about the place in which one finds Fukui, which is Japan, of course, and in the wider context, Asia as a whole. I suppose the most serious way in which this interest in Japan and things Japanese occurred was through my being invited to teach, perhaps I asked to teach, a course on Japan-USA relationships. And this course was of tremendous importance and relevance at that time because this was a period when there was great concern in the West, particularly in the USA, about the rapid rise in affluence and development of Japan itself. My teaching about the Japan-US relationship was based on its particularly being very high on the political and academic agendas of both countries. In other words, the seeming challenge posed to the USA by Japan being regarded as number one, which was actually the title of a well-known book by Ezra Vogel called Japan as Number One, Lessons for America, published in 1979. All of this made it a vital topic to be taught in American universities where I lived then. During this same period of which I'm speaking, I was involved in what was called the Pennsylvania Governor School, namely a school designed by, or at least attributed to, the thinking of the governor of the state of Pennsylvania. This was a program which lasted for about 6 weeks every year and which involved American high school students and some teachers from America, plus some visiting teachers from Japan, and occasionally visiting students from Japan. The two cities that were concretely involved in this relationship were Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, University of Pittsburgh on the one hand, Omiya on the other. I went to Omiya, Miyazaki, at least once, maybe twice. I hope you can see that all of these activities, these exchanges between two sets of students from two different countries, and the visitors between teachers from different countries, all involved, whether these people consciously knew it or not, a kind of self-localization, a kind of coming to terms with other countries, other contexts, and that kind of relationship, because many of the students who were taken from Pennsylvania had never actually been outside the state of Pennsylvania, let alone seriously thought about Japan. Although, I should add that many of them then decided to come to Japan, and if you stayed in Japan, still may be here. My second point of entry, or point from which to observe Japan, or Japanese matters, was, as you might not think, or might come as a surprise, was being invited to lecture for a while, 5 or 6 months in Brazil. One asks the question then, why is this a very relevant point from which to think about, to observe Japan and the kinds of issues about Japan that I'm talking about today and this evening. And it so happens that in 1906, the members of the San Francisco School Board, a city in central northern California, decided not to allow Japanese and Chinese students anymore. And the vote was very close. There were 6 people on that board. And in the hands of those 6 people was a decision which was taken, which had enormous worldwide consequences. In fact, one could argue that in a long, over time way, this has some bearing on why there ever was a Second World War, or First World War, but specifically a Second World War. Now, at that particular time, that particular period, in the late 19th century, particularly in the early 20th century, the Japanese economy, Japanese society generally, was in particularly bad shape itself. So there was a great desire on the part of the Japanese for emigration, preferably to the USA, for now being excluded from the USA. So where were they going to go and what were they going to do? So faced with this prohibition against immigration to the USA, what, as I said, did the Japanese do about this, or Japanese who wished to emigrate? What they did, in fact, was to find alternative countries in the Western Hemisphere, particularly Brazil, but to some smaller extent Peru. And incidentally, Peru for a while had a president of Japanese origin. But my major point is, of course, rather obvious, I hope, is that I was finding myself in Brazil, a very large country, one of the biggest in the world, finding myself thinking about Japan, and that wasn't necessarily why I went there in the first place, but nonetheless it struck me very much how important to me the view of Brazil was from a Brazilian standpoint, or from a standpoint of somebody living in Brazil for a while, as I did. On the occasion of my very first visit to Brazil, which was quite short because it was mainly for a conference, I later went for a longer stay. But my first visit, I was taken to, or rather I asked to be taken to the enclave, the place where most of the Japanese, or the sons and daughters of the Japanese immigrants lived. This is a place called Liberdade. It may be that somebody here in the audience has actually been to Liberdade, which is part of, as I say, part of Sao Paulo. But if they have, or they haven't, from what I observed in the late 1990s, it may be very different now, in the late 1990s, you might say, apart from the facial look of the people there, it was almost the opposite of what Japan is, what my impression of Japan had become through my brief visits to this country during the 1990s. I've had reason to, the opportunity to talk actually to Japanese academics about their own visits to Liberdade, and they tended to agree with my own impressions. Namely that it was a run-down place, rather dirty, filthy, and not at all pleasant from our point of view, and even I guess would have been from any of your point of view. So one asked the question, how come it was that people from Japan lived in such a place which was virtually the opposite of Japan? It's come to my mind right now in the last few minutes that this is a very good example. The condition of Liberdade and the conditions under which the Japanese immigrants lived at that time is very similar to the situation that was described as applying to American cities by the great American journalist Mencken when he talked about the libido of the ugly. In other words, he was talking about why was it that, or asking the question, why was it that many immigrants to Pittsburgh, an industrial city in northern part of the USA, why should it have so many ugly houses? Why should people want to emigrate from their own country to live in an ugly place, which they did? I must emphasize, however, that Liberdade may well be very different now than it was in the late 1990s, which was quite a long time ago. Nonetheless, my observations still hold, they still have relevance. Namely, I still was asking the question why there was living in this place, in what seemed to be a rather dirty, unhappy and unhygienic place. Why was it so contrasting with the place from which these people had emigrated, or their mothers and fathers had emigrated? So my question is still valid, even though the situation in Libertadi may be different now. So the contrast between Libertadi and Japan of my own experience was very different indeed. In any case, my major place of residence in Brazil was not Sao Paulo, where Libertadi is situated, but rather in Rio de Janeiro, which is a very, very different place, and where also quite a lot of Japanese people of Japanese origin live. It so happened, actually, that upon the occasion of my second longer-term visit to Brazil, for some reason that I now forget, I was immediately summoned, so to speak, to a conference in Kyoto. So I arrived in Brazil for the second time, to stay for 5 or 6 months. But then I was almost hardly off the plane before I was back on the plane, flying here, not to here, directly to Fukui, but nonetheless to Kyoto for another conference. I was located institutionally in Rio de Janeiro, as an academic advisor in a major university, and considered Japan there when I was living in Brazil from afar, but with increasing interest, not least because my master massage therapist in Rio was what? A Japanese immigrant. Or her mother and father had been Japanese immigrants to Brazil. So again, I kept bumping, as it were, into Japan wherever I went. In this case, it was Rio. Again, I should emphasize that such observations have nothing specifically at all to do with fluidity. But I do think, as I'm trying to show, I hope to convince you, that they do have enormous relevance, because the more you travel, the more you look at things from different standpoints, the more you become obliged to bring them into alignment, to bring conceptions of the world as a whole into alignment with one's own self and one's own circumstances. Well, what I should also add, that I was in Brazil, although still holding British citizenship. I was there while I was living in America, and since that time have become an American citizen. So I now hold dual citizenship between Britain and America. And I wish I still lived in America in spite of my old friend. That's not meant to be a serious comment, Mr. Trump. He's not my old friend, but he's very old, but he's not my friend. In any case, it's worth pointing out here that one of the most traveled air routes in the world at that time, and I think it's still true, is in fact between Tokyo and Sao Paulo. Namely, it's carried backwards and forwards. It helps people to maintain connections with Brazil. Of course, the situation of Brazilian people coming to play football in what was developed as a Japanese league for football players a few years ago is of great relevance in this context. This brings me to yet another important point, some of you may not be aware, that the importance of Zen Buddhism in Brazil is of considerable importance. In any case, it's of great interest to me to know more about how it was and came to be that Zen has traveled from Japan to Brazil. Of course, Zen has been particularly significant in this city or the area of this city. My major source of knowledge in this respect again comes about through another kind of personal experience of localization. Namely, upon visiting the University of West Sydney a few years ago in Australia, I was given a book by a woman named Christina Rocha. I think she is maybe of Japanese origin, but this is not the point. The book is entitled Zen in Brazil, The Quest for Cosmopolitan Modernity. Although I should say that Rocha, the author of this book, doesn't specifically mention Fukui. The interest in Zen in Brazil has developed mainly through haiku, which has become very popular indeed in Brazil. And of course, it first arrived there, or I shouldn't say of course, but it did arrive there first in French translation, which again is a kind of global twist to the whole circumstance. What I'm really arguing all the time is that we are thinking more globally, even though we don't necessarily know it consciously. We are global people. When people migrate from one country to another, they are in fact globalizing themselves, or their parents are globalizing them. So it's worth noting in any case that Suzuki in his book on Zen and Japanese culture, published in 1959, he dedicates a whole chapter of his Zen and Japanese culture to the relationship between Zen and haiku. So before we take a little break for how long, I'd just like to say that I've been talking so far mainly, but not only, about my personal experience of Brazil and my own autobiographical experience of it in relation to other visits I've made to other parts of the world. Well, of course, I was invited not only to talk generally about localization and about the world as a whole, but also about my direct impressions of the wonderful city in Fukui. And I have been taken to various places and have read a bit about the city. And in particular, I have enjoyed going, of course, to Heiji, particularly because it's known, and I did know this a little bit, but not enough, as the center of one of the Soto Zen's head temples in whole of Japan. And that this was one of the most striking things, perhaps because it's the first place that I visited and found it very beautiful, and indeed overwhelmingly beautiful in many respects. And insofar as this has a significance to the global, I think it's very important to realize that one is involved, whether one knows it or not, in saying, in a sense, where did this come from? How did it get here? I know that maybe people in that monastery think of themselves or temple as being just there. They are supposed to think they're just there. They don't have contact except for the letter, I understand, by communication, but not direct communication with the outside world. Nonetheless, they are still part of the world in which we live, in spite of how they themselves observe it, which is another aspect of the whole phenomenon of localization. That I myself, as somebody who just remarked to me during the interval, am particularly interested in religion. And the reason I haven't talked about it much is largely because it wasn't the topic for the discussion today, but also because most, but not all, Japanese academics dismiss religion, which, from my mind, is not merely puzzling, but quite frankly absurd, because they live, you all live in a very, from my point of view, very exceedingly religious country. It's religious because, I call it religious because there are shrines and temples everywhere. There are sacred places everywhere. I don't think any country in the world uses the word sacred, except perhaps for India, as does Japan. And so the notion of sacredness and the notion of religiousness, the notion of spirituality is extreme. Well, I shouldn't say extreme in a critical sense, but it's very widespread and obviously evident to the outsider. And I don't know how people who have immigrated from, shall we say, America or Japan, Germany to Japan, feel this or have been converted to the idea that Japan doesn't have religion. I don't know what the solution is. Is there anybody of that kind here? I'll be glad to hear what their own observation is. Perhaps what I've just said, it doesn't apply to people, residents of Fukui itself, or to the surrounding area. So I would be grateful in question and answer time to hear whether you yourself regard yourself as exception to the general view held by Japanese academics that there is no significance for religion anywhere. Because I know from personal experience that in international societies devoted to religion, there are very few Japanese residents, except in very controversial so-called sects, such as Sokakaka, Tenrikyo, and so on. I've also had the opportunity, in addition to my great impression that the temple made upon me, being to the Paper and Culture Museum at the Etchizen, also to the Fukui Megeni, which is what I wish to say a few words of, namely that this particular visit was striking because it involved a sense of how Japan, as of Fukui, is part of the world as a whole. It's a very, very consciousness of the far away. I'm not so sure how people in Fukui are conscious of the world far away or care about it. In any case, I was particularly interested in visiting the Fukui Megane place because of its fairly recent acquisition or combination with an Italian firm. And I asked the question whether the corporation owners thought of this as a kind of compromise of their famous phrase, made 100% in Japan. Well, in a sense, it isn't. It doesn't compromise their own claim, because they can still make the same claim, because the crucial word there is made, because they make it up from some components or materials which are brought from abroad. Nonetheless, I have a feeling that there is a kind of opening in the case of the eyewear business in Fukui, which is not just confined to that particular corporation, but there is a sense in which it is becoming more involved in the world as a whole. To that extent, it is, this isn't the best word to use, I would tend to use the word succumb to localizing tendencies. Temptation. So these are two of the places that I visited, amongst many others. Well, not many others, but quite a few others. But I'm still very interested in, it's not so much me talking now, interested in your own feelings or sentiments about living in Fukui. Because I understand that there is evidence to suggest that Fukui people are happier than people usually are in other places. Now, there are claims made by some countries or counties in Europe that they are the happiest people in the world. That has been said frequently in recent years of Denmark, which I don't find particularly happy when I observe it from as an outsider. Nonetheless, there seems to be a kind of competition of who is the happiest people in the world. I hope it's true that you are all the happiest people in the world, but nonetheless, I'm still very interested in how one estimates and measures this kind of sentiment.